Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jorvik, and today I will be continuing my ranking series of the MCU with Phase 2. If you haven't seen my Phase 1 video, the link will be up here as well as in the description. I went ahead and made some changes to the board as you can see here. So let me just go ahead and go through the changes that I made while still keeping the same rankings that I did in my Phase 1. I added some things. As you can see here, I changed the ranking tiers to quotes that I think best represent my feeling towards those particular tiers. Obviously for S tier, we have Excelsior, which is one of Stan Lee's most famous catchphrase. After that, for the A tier, we have I Love You 3000, which I think is a very fitting for an A tier. In the B tier, we have I Still Believe in Heroes, which is a quote from Nick Fury from the first Avengers, which basically got the Avengers to, well, avenge Phil Coulson. C tier is I'm Still Worthy, which is of course the quote that Thor had in Avengers Endgame when after his talk with his mother, he reached out for Mjolnir, able to say that he was still worthy. And this tier is mostly reserved for those movies and shows that I think a lot of people didn't like, but I think still need the recognition that they deserve for what they do for the universe, what they do for characters, etc. But we'll get to those when we get to those. And I actually added an F tier. I really call it an F tier. I don't really think anything Marvel does is F tier. Like I said, there are some stinkers, but I wouldn't really call them F tier. And really, there's only one project that comes to mind. And I think when we get to it, I think a lot of people will agree with me when we get there. But of course, the quote there is, I'm sorry, little one. Of course, said by Thanos in Infinity War. As always, we have the Phase 2 films at the bottom here. So in today's video, we'll be going over Iron Man 3, Thor the Dark World, Captain America Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, Avengers Age of Ultron, and finally, Ant-Man. As always, if you like this type of content, I plan on doing the X-Men Fox films. I also want to do the Star Wars films and TV shows, and as well as the Marvel Legacy films like Daredevil, Elektra, all that. So if you want to see those videos, click that like and subscribe button and the bell to be notified when those videos are released. Okay, starting off with Iron Man 3. I mentioned this in the Phase 1 video that I think Iron Man 3 is the best out of the Iron Man trilogy. Now, obviously, there are things about it that I dislike, like any movie, but I think overall it is a generally good film. The big selling points for me was I do like the misdirection with Mandarin. I know a lot of people didn't like that, but honestly, we got a much better Mandarin down the road in Shang-Chi, which we'll get to. But what I really liked about this movie is that it explored more of Tony's human side and how the PTSD of the Battle of New York and how it influenced him and how he basically just went crazy in trying to protect the world and all this kind of stuff like that. And I think this was a stepping stone for him to create Ultron. It was a stepping stone for him to fight Thanos in Infinity War. And ultimately, it could be a stepping stone to his decision in Endgame to, make that snap. We also get a hint at a new villain organization, AIM. Advanced Ideal Mechanics, which I really wish would make a comeback. And I hope they do in Armor Wars or honestly, literally anything. I think AIM, like Hydra, needs to have this ever-presence in the MCU, and it kind of died with Aldrich Killian. On that note, let's go ahead and talk about the villain, Aldrich Killian, who claimed himself to be the Mandarin, but obviously we know that he's not the real Mandarin. He is the only real drawback of this film, because I do like the extremist plot. I mean, that was a big thing in the comics as well. I do think they did a misstep with his character in that. I will agree with that, regardless of the Mandarin reveal. But overall, I do like the conflict. We got Rhodey as Iron Patriot, who in the comics was Norman Osborn. Obviously, they couldn't do it. There is still a bright future that we could get Iron Patriot again. We also got to see like 40 suits. I think it was the Mark 43 was the main suit in the movie, and we got to see just all of these other suits that really kind of build out Tony's armory. I know there was a lot of contention with the end of this film where he was able to get the arc reactor removed from his chest and he was able to move on. And I think that works in a way. Obviously, he does come back in Civil War. He comes back in Infinity War, and obviously Age of Ultron later in the phase. And they do address that in the films, so I can't fault them too hard for that. Overall, I do like Iron Man 3. I don't think it's the most rewatchable film, but it does a lot for the universe, especially for Tony. And I think it just caps a really good trilogy, regardless of what people think. So, as always, I'm going to put Iron Man 3 in I Love You 3000. It's going to be on the low end because of the villain. Actually, no, I think it is better than Iron Man 2. But because of the villain, I'm going to keep it lower than Captain America and Iron Man. Okay, so moving on to Thor: The Dark World was the next film released in November of 2013, I believe. What I liked about this film mostly is that it was a more serious film, and I think that's why a lot of people just had a gripe with it, from what I remember at the time that this film came out. Nowadays, it doesn't really get talked about a lot because everyone just complains that there are women and minorities in Marvel now, which, again, grow up. It's not that serious. However, I have been an advocate for this film since day one. Now, I know it's not perfect. I do think there's a lot that kind of holds this film back. I think, one, it's too long. And I think also Malekith, the villain, the Dark Elf, wasn't really a threat. And I felt like if maybe they kept him around, or if they just, gave him more to do than just stand around and send his bodyguard, his lackey, his henchman curse after everyone. That's the one thing about Malekith. I mean, he's not that great in the comics either, but still, give the guy more to do. Overall, I love the visuals of this film. I love the score of this film. And Frig's funeral after she dies is just so impactful. And the way that we go back to that in Endgame, I think really makes this movie stronger. And I really like that when Endgame came out and we were able to go back to that film, they made that movie matter more. And that's something that I really do appreciate. But all in all, it's still the weakest, I think, of the Thor films. It's definitely better than Thor 1. But other than that, I mean, what else is there to say about it? It was the third movie that introduces a Infinity Stone. Obviously, we had Iron Man 2, Captain America with the Tesseract, and of course that thread carried over into of the first Avengers movie. And I didn't mention it in my last video, but Avengers was also the first time we saw the Mind Stone and Loki's scepter. Now, at the time, we didn't know that it was the Mind Stone. Of course, we wouldn't know that until Age of Ultron, but I'm still technically counting it in the Avengers that was the second movie to introduce an Infinity Stone. And obviously this is the third movie to introduce an Infinity Stone, the Aether. And I wish we would have saw more reality warping. I mean, this could have been something that just kind of hints at the multiverse, but it was kind of cool to see the 9 realms. We saw Svartalheim, which is where the Dark Elves are from. We saw Alfheim, which is where elves are from in Norse mythology. And of course, I believe we saw hints of Muspelheim and Niflheim, of course, as well as Asgard and Midgard, which is Earth. So overall, it's still expanded because this is before Guardians. It still expanded that cosmic universe a little bit. We got to see more planets. We got to see more creatures and aliens. But again, just scratching the surface enough. And of course, we wouldn't fully break that barrier until 2 movies after this, Guardians of the Galaxy, which we'll get to. So overall, I do think this is a very interesting movie. And of course, it ends with Loki on the throne, which is a thread that will be carried over into the third Thor movie. I do think there's a lot of redeeming qualities of this film that honestly should be studied. But with that being said, I'm actually going to put it on the high B tier. I still believe in heroes. Okay, now this is a big one for me. Moving on to Captain America 2, The Winter Soldier. Personally, I think this is still my top 3 Marvel film. Like obviously, like Infinity War and Endgame are up there. I mean, for me, and I'll talk about it more when we get to Phase 4, but Eternals is up there for me. There's just something about Captain America, there's just something about Winter Soldier that just resonates me with so much. And I think because at the time this movie came out, I was a senior in high school. I was getting ready to enlist in the military. So I think having a lot of that mentality, and then this movie comes out, and then I don't know. It just resonated me a lot. I still watch this film. I think this is probably my most watched film. Just like the cinematography, the acting, the reveal that Hydra has been within S.H.I.E.L.D. this entire time. I mean, there's a lot of leaps and logics that go through it, but the way that they just expand that back history with Operation Paperclip, with Bucky being rescued and turned into the Winter Soldier, with him, this was the first hint that we saw that Bucky could have been responsible for the deaths of Tony Stark, or not Tony Stark, I'm sorry, of Tony Stark's parents, Howard, and I believe his mother's name is Maria. So we got the first hints of that, which of course would be confirmed in Civil War. And then just like this beautiful spy thriller of just, you know, taking down an entire international organization. I mean, it was pretty ambitious. I mean, honestly, it was, for me, it was Avengers 1.5, you know, just how like Civil War is Avengers 2.5. I really think that this movie did so much for the universe at the time. I mean, it dismantled S.H.I.E.L.D. It literally changed the universe. So for me, this is an Excelsior film. I mean, honestly, I would put it above the first Avengers, but I think just being an S tier film just is what it deserves. Also, not to mention the directors, Anthony and Joe Russo, this was their first MCU film, and they went on to do, obviously, Captain America, Civil War. They went on to do Infinity War. They went on to do Endgame, and now they're going to Doomsday and Secret Wars. I mean, already they're responsible for some of the top tier Marvel films, and I don't know, I'm excited. So it is definitely S tier. All right, so moving on to Guardians of the Galaxy. Like Thor 1, this was a very risky film for Marvel at the time. I mean, we just had The Winter Soldier, which was just this dark and gritty, grounded superhero story, and now we have this fun, colorful, just band of misfits out in outer space that we have no idea who they are. At the time this came out, I knew who the Guardians were, but I never read any of their comments, and I really wasn't like a diehard fan of, you know, the Guardians. It was very interesting, one, that this movie was announced, and two, it was good. I mean, obviously it was James Gunn, and while he had a career before this, I really think Guardians propelled his career even more than what it already was. I mean, just the visuals of space and how they travel, and just the rules that it established that are still visuals that are used even as recently as the Marvels. I mean, this film really was a game changer at the time, because now we fully open the door to the cosmic side of what the Marvel Universe can be by introducing us to Peter. He was our grounded character from Earth. You know, he was abducted as a kid, and, you know, while we didn't see a lot of his early childhood, we did catch up with him as an adult and just kind of see how a Terran navigates, you know, this other world, and I guess, well, worlds, and what that looks like to him. I mean, the score, fantastic, and not even talking about the actual soundtrack that James Gunn put together. I mean, it's just iconic, and we'll talk more about the soundtracks as we get to Volume 2 and Volume 3, but I'll just go ahead and say it now. I think Volume 1, classic. Volume 2, good, but forgettable. I honestly couldn't name like one song from that. And then obviously I think 3 has the best soundtrack for me personally, because a lot of that music I actually grew up with. So I don't know, that's just me. But yeah, I mean, just a solid cast of characters, wonderful misfits, and just an all-around fun movie. At the time, we didn't really have to watch. You know, it wasn't required viewing, obviously, until we got to Infinity War and Endgame. But overall, still a great film nonetheless. So I'm going to put it just above Iron Man. I'm sorry. I do think it's better than Iron Man, and it's going to go into A tier. I love you 3000. Okay. On to another controversial film. Avengers: Age of Ultron. I have also been an advocate for this film since day one. For years, I've been talking about how good Avengers: Age of Ultron was. Still is. And I'm glad that recently I've seen a lot of people go back and say, hey, you know what, this film actually isn't that bad. Don't get me wrong, like these other films, there are things that I feel like are negative about it. While I like James Spader, I don't think he was the right voice or role for Ultron. I think Ultron should have been more robotic. I mean, he still could have voiced Ultron, just not as animated. I think that's really my only gripe with this film. Plus, we also got introduced to two new characters, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, although I wish Quicksilver was still around because I do like that character. Well, I like both those characters, really. But obviously at the time, you know, there was Days of Future Past that just came out, I think the year before. Was that 2014? Obviously we had that Quicksilver, that version of Quicksilver, who could be, you know, a mutant, but they couldn't use the term mutant in Age of Ultron. But looking back at it now, Disney owns Fox, and now all those characters are technically owned by main Marvel now. It's just kind of funny to look back at that just a few years ago, how crazy that was. But yeah, I think Age of Ultron, like I mentioned when I was talking about Iron Man 3, it continues that trend that Tony wants to protect the world, right? And I think him being responsible, along with Bruce Banner, but him mostly being responsible for the creation of Ultron, I think is very important for the universe, at least this version of the universe. Like, it just makes sense. And I remember at the time, people were like, well, Hank Pym is the one that creates Ultron. How are you going to create Ultron without Hank Pym? Because obviously the Ant-Man movie wasn't out yet. But I don't know. It just makes sense for this universe that it started with Tony. Tony's responsible for all of this kicking off point of this universe. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Civil War, because that actually comes back. And I think I mentioned it in my last video, either for Iron Man, when I talked about Iron Man, or Iron Man 2, that, you know, a lot of people complain that Spider-Man in the MCU is Iron Man Jr., which, sure, but they just, like, he doesn't have his own villains because all these villains are related to Tony. And it's like, yeah, because Tony Stark in this universe was a big deal. Like, it just makes sense story-wise that he would be responsible for a lot of this villainy that goes around. Another gripe I do have with this film is that we have bickering in the team. Like, at this point in time, the Avengers have been a team for a few years, so I feel like we didn't really need more bickering and like people like you know, arguing with each other. I just feel like that should have been gone in this film. But other than that, I do like the set piece of Sokovia as a whole and how it feeds into, again, this is another world-changing film. I mean, a whole half of a city was destroyed, gone. Of course, this led to the Sokovia Accords, which we'll get to in Phase 3 of Civil War. We also get Vision in this. We get hints to Amadeus Cho. Again, it's just that this universe just grew a little bit, but at the same time, earth-shattering. I do think that Ultron is still around somewhere in the universe. It's just, I don't know if they'll bring him back. I would be interested to see him come back in either Doomsday or Infinity War. RDJ's version of Victor Von Doom created Ultron and it was successful. I don't know, that could be interesting. But all in all, I think Avengers Age of Ultron is a pretty solid film. It's definitely not S tier. I don't think it's better than the first Avengers, but I still think it deserves its recognition alongside here next to Guardians of the Galaxy and I Love You 3000. All right, and the final film of Phase 2. Now, Ant-Man was a strange movie, I think, leading up to its release. Obviously, it was originally going to be written and directed by Edgar Wright, but he left the project and due to creative differences. Now, I don't think that we know what those creative differences were, but I imagine it was probably along the lines of Edgar Wright wanted to do his own movie, and Kevin Feige and other producers were like, okay, but it needs to connect to the rest of the MCU in this way. And he's like, no. I think that's what happened. So we have Paul Rudd as the Scott Lang version of Ant-Man. He's the second Ant-Man. I think there's been 4 total. It was Hank Pym, Scott Lang. I don't remember what the third guy's name is, but I think the third guy was like a creep, like real creep show in the comics, if I remember correctly. And I think there was a 4th one, but I don't remember what his name is. So we get Scott Lang, we get Hope, we get Hank Pym, played by Michael Douglas, which great role, honestly. And in this film, we also get to see that Ant-Man and the Wasp existed in the 80s, and they were agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. during the 70s and 80s, which again, this world building that these movies do to fill in those gaps, you know, I just really appreciate it. While the story is very simple, I do like that this was a different kind of film. It was a heist film. I mean, it's just a fun heist film. I really like the score in this, the dun 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 dun. I don't know, I just like that little theme. It's just nice little staccato notes. I love it. And of course, this movie I think is genuinely funny. I think there is a lot. Paul Rudd is just one of the funniest people alive, and I'm really glad that he's still around. Of course, when we get to Ant-Man Quantumania, I'll talk more about what I wanted from this character. However, I do think as a origin film, solely as an origin film, and, you know, the end of Phase 2, I think it's a solid film. I really do. The villain, again, I think is what drags this movie down for me, because it's just another, like, oh, the villain is just the guy with the same powers as the hero, and I really dislike that. That's why I liked Ghost in Ant-Man and the Wasp, because Ghost was different from Ant-Man and, well, Wasp. Anyways, but it's Yellow Jacket. I mean, it's just the same old thing. I think the Yellow Jacket design is cool and interesting, but Yellow Jacket in the comics was Hank Pym. Is even in the animated show where Hank Pym kind of loses it, eventually becomes Yellow Jacket as kind of more of a, not an anti-hero, but just a more darker version of Ant-Man. Other than that, I do think that this is genuinely a good film, but it's still weak in my opinion. But while I do love the Ant-Man character, I do think his trilogy is definitely the weakest out of all of the trilogies we have so far in the MCU. But I think it's just because his films are really low stakes, except for the last one, more or less. We'll talk about it when we get there. So I am gonna put it in I Still Believe in Heroes, but I do think it's a very high B film. And that's it. Let me know what you think about my rankings. Obviously, like I keep mentioning, these are my opinions. You know, I'm not going to say that these films are the best. I know I've ranked some of these films where people don't normally rank them. But again, this is just from my perspective, from my, you know, knowledge of storytelling and like filmmaking. Like, this is just where I think these films belong. Let me know in the comments below how you would rank these films. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this type of content. It really does help out the channel, and I really do appreciate it. But with that being said, my name is Jorvik. I'll see you in the next one.